The desert morning had begun like any other, the sun creeping over the ragged teeth of the distant mesas, lighting the world in a slow wash of gold that promised another day of relentless heat. Cowboy Luke Rydell rode along the dry wash with his hat pulled low, scanning for signs of stray cattle. But something off to the right snagged the edge of his vision, a crooked outline that didn't belong to the land. At first, he dismissed it as driftwood or an old crate someone had abandoned, but when the wind shifted, he heard a faint, broken sound, like a moan swallowed by sand. Luke's brow tightened as he turned his horse and approached cautiously. The shape came into focus. A battered wooden handcart, one wheel bent inward, rope hanging from the frame in shredded curls. The board were splintered, sun-bleached, and dust coated everything in a thick, rust-colored layer. But the sound came again, weak but unmistakably human. Luke swung down from his saddle with a soft thud and placed a calming hand on his horse's neck. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Though his own heartbeat was picking up, he stepped closer, boots crunching against gravel, and there, on the cart, lay a young Apache woman. She was motionless, except for the shallow rise of her chest. Her long black hair was tangled around her shoulders like dark weeds, her skin dry and cracked from sun and dehydration. Her legs lay stiff, twisted unnaturally, covered in dust that looked days old. Her wrists were tied with rawhide, the edges cutting deep into her skin. Luke froze for a moment, anger rising in his throat. He had seen violence, he had seen cruelty, but something about this, about leaving a woman as vulnerable in open desert, made his jaw clench hard enough to hurt. He knelt beside her, offering his shadow as shade. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked in a voice gentler than most men thought he possessed. For a moment she didn't move, and he feared he had come too late. But then her eyelids fluttered, lifting just enough to reveal dark, glassy eyes clouded with pain yet burning with a stubborn flicker of life. Luke leaned closer. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "You're safe." She exhaled a faint whisper, something in Apache he couldn't understand, but the tone was filled with despair, resignation, as if she believed no one could save her now. Luke drew his knife and carefully sliced the rawhide bindings at her wrists. The moment the restraint snapped, her hands twitched involuntarily, the first motion they'd made in who knew how long. He gently lifted one of her legs to check for feeling, but she sucked in a sharp, pain breath, and he realized quickly that everything below her waist was limp, unresponsive. Paralysis, a severe injury. Maybe from a fall, maybe from a blow, maybe from whatever brutes had left her here. His gaze shifted to the ground around them. Wagon tracks, 3, maybe 4, headed west. Boot prints with large strides. A scrap of torn cloth caught in a thorn bush. They had left in a hurry. Abandoning her wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Luke felt heat rise up his neck. "Savages," he muttered under his breath, though he knew full well the word belonged to those who abandoned a helpless woman, not the people she came from. He lifted her head slightly and held his canteen to her cracked lips. She drank in tiny sips, as if her body had forgotten how to swallow. When he pulled it away, her eyes focused on him more clearly, searching his face as if trying to decide whether he was real or another trick of the sun. "You're going to be all right," he murmured, even though he had no idea how he was going to make that true. The handcart was in miserable shape, the sun unforgiving, and the nearest settlement was miles away. Leaving her alone to fetch help would be a death sentence. Carrying her on horseback, without support, could worsen her injuries. And dragging the car across the rough desert floor would be slow, exhausting, and dangerous. Coyotes had already begun to linger at a distance, shadows slipping behind rocks, waiting. Luke felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could walk away. No law demanded he risk his life for the stranger. But then she blinked, slowly, as if telling him she expected him to leave like the others had. That small, resigned certainty in her eyes struck him harder than any blow. He stood, gripped the wooden handles of the battered handcart, tested the weight, and nearly buckled. She was light, far too light for a grown woman. Evidence of suffering long before today. Luke adjusted his stance, tightened his grip, and pulled again. The cart jerked. The bent was squealing, but it moved. He glanced down at her. "Well, ma'am," he said, voice steady and sure, "looks like today you're wrong about being left behind." Then he leaned forward, braced his legs, and with all the force his tired muscles could muster, began dragging her towards safety, the cart creaking behind him as the desert sun climbed higher. The handcart groaned with every pull as Luke dragged across the harsh desert terrain, the sun climbing higher until it pressed down like a smothering hand. Sweat stung his eyes and every muscle in his back burned, but he refused to slow down. The Apache woman, Tala, as she had softly told him, watched him with a mix of pain, exhaustion, and something like disbelief. She tried to speak more, but each word scraped out of her like a stone. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale beneath the dust. Luke kept glancing at her to make sure she was still conscious. He didn't know much about spinal injuries, but he knew fear when he saw it, and she carried a deep one buried behind her stoic expression. Around midday, he found a little shade beside a rock formation and lowered the cart carefully. He offered her water again, holding the canteen to her lips. This time she drank more steadily, then whispered, "They took our horses, our food, everything." Luke crouched beside her, listening. "My brother fought. They hit him. I fought too. They struck my back. Could not move my legs. I slowed them. They said, 'Let the desert finish me.'" Her voice broke, her eyes glistening with a mixture of pain and humiliation. Luke shook his head. No decent person leaves someone like that. She stared at him long and hard, as though trying to understand the strange cowboy who kept dragging her across the desert like his own life depended on it. After a short rest, he continued hauling the cart, moving toward the distant cottonwoods where a narrow river cut across the land, a place where he knew he could refill water. But the approach to the river was rough, full of uneven rocks and thorn brush that snagged his shirt and scratched his arms. Twice the wheel of the cart got stuck so deeply he had to lift the whole thing, grunting with the effort. Tala tried to push herself up an apology, but she fell back with a soft cry. "Don't try that," Luke told her firmly. "You're hurt enough." As the sun began to dip toward late afternoon, the river glimmered ahead. Luke let out a breath of relief. But the moment they reached the shallow reeds, a rustle of movement froze him in place. 3 men on horseback emerged from the riverbank, rifles slung casually across their arms. Rough-looking types, scavengers, raiders. Tala inhaled sharply, her eyes wide with fear. "Them," she whispered. Luke's hand instinctively drifted toward his holster. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his jaw, barked a laugh. "Well, looky here. The girl's still alive. Should have guessed. Some folks just don't die easy." Luke stepped forward, blocking their view of her with his body. "You left her to die?" The scarred man shrugged. "She wasn't worth the trouble. Can't ride, can't walk. What did you pick her up for? Charity?" The other men chuckled, circling slightly, not close enough to attack, but close enough to threaten. Luke kept his stance relaxed, but every part of him was tight as a drawn rope. "She comes with me," he said simply. "Ain't asking." The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle. "This ain't your business. Cowboy, ride off while I'm letting you." Luke didn't move. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of river mud and horse sweat. The men's hands hovered near their rifles. Luke could sense them deciding whether he was worth the trouble. One of the riders finally nudged his horse closer, grinning with yellowed teeth. "Walk away, friend. Ain't nobody gonna know." That was when Luke struck. Quick as lightning, he stepped sideways, kicked up a cloud of sand with his boot, and dug behind the cart, drawing his revolver in a single smooth motion. 2 gunshots cracked across the riverbank, startling birds from the reeds. The riders yanked their horses back, swearing as bullets ricocheted off stone. Luke didn't shoot to kill. Not yet, but he made it very clear he was faster and far more willing to fight than they'd expected. The scarred man glared at him for several tense seconds before finally spitting into the dust. "Not worth it," he muttered, signaling his men. They turned their horses and galloped off the reeds, disappearing into the canyon shadows. Luke stayed crouched until he was certain they were gone, then slowly lowered his gun. His breath shook. He turned to Tala, who stared at him in disbelief, chest rising fast with fear and relief. You fought them for me," she whispered. Luke holstered his revolver and walked back to the cart handles. "Told you," he said quietly, gripping the wood again. "Ain't nobody getting left behind today." And despite the ache in every limb, despite the danger that would surely come again, he pulled her forward toward the river, determined to get her somewhere safe, even if the whole desert turned against them. By the time Luke reached the canyon settlement 2 days later, he was walking like a man hollowed out by exhaustion, each step a battle against a throbbing ache in his legs and back. Dust clung to him in thick layers. His hat was bent out of shape, and his voice had long since gone hoarse from offering constant reassurance to Tala every time she drifted toward unconsciousness. But he never stopped. Not when the nights turned cold enough to bite through his coat. Not when the cart wheel nearly fell off on a steep slope. And not when coyotes trailed him from the ridges with hungry patience. When the settlement finally appeared, a cluster of small wooden structures tucked between high canyon walls, Luke felt his legs nearly buckle with relief. A few townsfolk turned their heads as he dragged the broken cart into view, their eyes widening at the sight of the paralyzed Apache woman lying weakly on the planks. "Medic!" someone shouted, and 2 strong men hurried over to help lift Tala from the cart, carrying her inside the healer's hut. Luke followed close behind, swaying slightly from fatigue, but refusing to leave her side until he knew she was in safe hands. The healer, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp, attentive eyes, examined Tala with gentle but precise movements. She pressed along her spine, checked her pulse, and asked her a few questions in a calm voice. Luke waited outside the doorway, gripping the doorframe because he feared his legs might give out if he let go. The minutes stretched out unbearably. Every sound from inside made his heart lurch. Soft groans, murmured words, the rustle of blankets. He dragged her across half the desert on nothing but stubbornness and hope. Now, with her fate in someone else's hands, his body finally allowed itself to feel the crushing fatigue and the creeping fear that he might have gotten her here too late. When the healer finally stepped outside, she placed a steadying hand on Luke's arm. "She's alive," she said. "Dehydrated. Weak. Spine injured badly, but not beyond healing. With rest and care, she has a chance." Luke closed his eyes briefly, relief sweeping through him so deeply it nearly brought him to his knees. He nodded, murmured a rough, "Thank you," and stepped inside the room where Tala lay on a woven blanket, her breathing slow but steadier now. She turned her head slightly, eyes finding his as soon as he entered. "You came," she whispered, her voice fragile but clearer than before. Luke knelt beside her, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "Told you I'd get you somewhere safe." Her fingers twitched, as though she wanted to reach for him but wasn't sure she could. After a moment, she managed to lift her hand just an inch, and Luke caught it gently. It was warm now, no longer cold like it had been in the desert night. The next days passed in a quiet rhythm. Luke repaired the handcart in the settlement's workshop, replacing the broken wheel, sanding the splintered boards, oiling the axles until they turned smoothly. He did it partly because he needed something to keep his hands busy, but mostly because he wanted the cart to mean something new. Not a symbol of abandonment, but of survival. Every morning he visited Tala, carrying a small meal or fresh water, sitting beside her as the healer worked or as she rested. She began to tell him more about her people, her village, her brother who had tried to protect her. She said she dreamed at night of the desert swallowing her, only to wake and find Luke sitting nearby, humming softly as he whittled a piece of wood or cleaned his revolver. She would watch him, quiet and still, as though memorizing the way he breathed, the way his brow furrowed when he thought, the way his voice softened whenever he spoke to her. One evening, when the canyon walls glowed deep gold in the fading sunlight, Tala managed to sit upright with the healer's help. It was only for a moment, but it was a victory, a promise of recovery. Luke stood in the doorway, staring in awe. She turned to him with a small smile, tired but proud. "You saved my life," she said simply. Luke shook his head. "Just did what any man ought to." "No," she said with quiet certainty. "Not any man." Her gaze held his for a long moment, filled with gratitude deeper than words. She told him her people would come for her soon, that scouts were already searching. "When they find me," she said, "I will go home, but I want you to visit. You will be welcomed among us." Luke's chest warmed with a feeling he hadn't expected. He tipped his hat with a slow, genuine smile. "Reckon I'd like that." As he sat beside her, the newly repaired handcart stood outside the hut, gleaming in the soft evening light. A silent witness to a journey that had bound two lives together, not by blood or tribe, but by courage, by compassion, and by one cowboy's refusal to walk away when someone most needed him.